Hello and welcome to Hour of History. I'm the host Stephen Bauman, and this week we have an excellent show for you. Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at www.audibletrial.com. There you'll find over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. This week's guest is Mingyuan Zhang. She's currently finishing her PhD in sociocultural anthropology at the University of Western Ontario in Canada. It's a great privilege to have Mingyuan on the show, as I met her at a Canadian anthropology conference in Santiago de Cuba, where I learned of her research and knew immediately that she would be a great guest on Hour of History. Not only has she traveled all over the globe, done some excellent research, and recently completed a dissertation on Chinese cultural interactions in Madagascar, but she's just a great person. So enjoy the show, enjoy Hour of History, thanks for subscribing, and be sure to stick around to the end of the show so you can get some great recommendations for your Audible free trial. Courtesy of Hour of History. Our world, anytime, anyplace.
This is the Hour of History podcast. Our world, anytime, anyplace. And now from the Hour of History studio in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, your Hour of History starts right now.
Hello, and welcome to Hour of History. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Mingyuan.
Hi, nice to meet you.
How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. So I had the pleasure of reading your recently completed dissertation about being Chinese in Madagascar. Before we get started on sort of the content of that dissertation and sort of the global interactions of Chinese right now, there's a lot of interesting stuff there. But first, why don't you tell me, how did you come to be an anthropologist?
I came to anthropology from a very unconditional way. I did my undergrad in China at Renmin University of China, and it was in international politics. At that time, I envisioned doing international politics as actually the project I'm doing right now, but actually it wasn't. In political science, it's more quantitative research, but I'm more interested in qualitative research and then hands-on fieldwork. So after I did my undergrad, I went to Canada, and then I applied a master program in University of Western Ontario Anthropology. Then I continued as a PhD student.
So you got your start in political science, which is typically more like quantitative and like rules-based, or was it political science?
It's international politics, but
okay.
It's
So kind of like interdisciplinary.
Yeah, but in China, international politics, when I took it, the program had really focused on theories.
Okay.
But there was not many hands-on research opportunities.
And were you always interested in Africa? Now, most of your research takes place in Madagascar.
Yeah, no, that was just that started with my PhD project.
Okay.
Yeah. That and how I came to Madagascar, that's thanks to my supervisor. He has been working in Madagascar for more than 20 years. And he took me to Madagascar. The first time I went with him was because he has a field school going on in Madagascar, and he regularly takes Canadian undergrad students to Madagascar. And then I was his TA for during one of the field courses.
And so what is your sort of exposure? How did you get into this study? You didn't know the language, presumably?
No, before I went to Madagascar, I knew nothing about the language. So they have two official languages, because Madagascar is a former colony of France. So they speak, one of the official languages is French, but their native language is Malagasy, which is Austronesian language that has more similarities with indigenous Taiwanese or Philippine languages.
And presumably these are not being taught in Canada. You have to go there and sort of learn. Like, how did you, I'm a big fan of Duolingo, but like, how would you go and learn these languages?
The French part, you can learn French in Canada. So I took some undergraduate courses in Canada. And for learning Malagasy, there is not so many ways to learn it in Canada. So I have to go to Madagascar first and then learn it from there. And the Malagasy that I speak is the dialect that people in the northern part of the island speak. So it's called Sakalava. So it's very different from the official dialect of Malagasy, which is based on the Medina people living on the Central Highlands.
So I don't imagine a whole lot of people speak Malagasy. What does it sound like?
A lot of people speak in Malagasy where?
I don't know. And I've never come across a Malagasy speaker.
Yeah, I mean, it's mainly used in Madagascar, but how does it sound like? For example, you say hello to people. If it's official dialect, it's salama. It's actually the Arabic hello.
Oh, like salam alaikum.
Yeah, yes, exactly. But the dialect I speak, it's Balatar. It's like the dialect in the north.
Okay,
yeah,
so that's very interesting. And so you first get exposure to this as a TA. Did you have in mind already a sort of potential project that you were going to work on, or?
Yes, I did. Before I went as a TA, my supervisor suggested to me that there is a sugar plantation managed by a Chinese state-owned corporation not too far from the city that he conducted all of his field work. So he actually suggested me to check it out, and it could be a potentially interesting research. So I have a research plan in mind before I go. Yeah.
Interesting. So now he's already established in Madagascar, and there's a sugar plantation. Were you already well known? How many people are in the cities? What is the kind of picture for someone who doesn't really know Madagascar other than the cartoon animals in the movie?
Oh yeah, the cartoons doesn't say anything about Madagascar. First of all, it's a very diverse island. It's a very diverse country. It's hard to give a general picture of how the country is. Most of the images people think when they think of Madagascar, maybe some baobab trees and lemurs. But actually, the Central Highlands are very different from the coastal areas. The city that I was in is called Antiranana. It's also called Diego Suarez.
Ah.
So it's the biggest city, and it's on the very northern tip of the island. There are a lot of beaches in that area. It's very beautiful. It's like a typical tropical landscape.
And so to give me a sort of picture of how big the island is, how do you get there coming from Canada to Antiranana?
Antiranana. Okay. To go there from Canada, you fly from Toronto, and what I did is I transferred in Paris, and Air France goes to the capital city of Madagascar. It's called Antananarivo. They have very long names.
Easy for you to say.
Yeah, and then from the capital city to the city that I worked in, you can fly. It's 2 hours flight, operated by Air Madagascar. You can also take what they call bush taxi, or in French, taxi bus.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's around 1,500 kilometers. But if you take bush taxi, it's just basically intercity public transportation in Madagascar. It's going to take at least 25 hours.
Oh, so I'm assuming as an anthropologist, you were eager to see the lay of the land, and you decided not to fly in.
Because I did that trip several times, so most of the times I did not fly. But that trip is very tiring. So at one point you want to fly. Trust me, because I went to Madagascar twice, and the second time I went, from the capital city to Antananarivo, I took the taxi bus. But that time it took me almost 40 hours to get there.
Wow!
Because there was a traffic jam. A truck was there was a car accident on the national road. Yeah.
And so there's just like one national road, and how many is this a shared taxi? How big is it? Is it just like a Jeep or what?
No, the Jeep is the better choice. The Jeep is basically reserved for tourists who pay more money. They have 4x4. A lot of tourists would hire drivers to drive 4x4. But bush taxi is basically a minivan.
Oh, okay.
And then they would change the seats in it to add more seats. So you don't have much space. If it's long trip, then at least you can have like a seat of your own.
And what is the stop situation? Do you stop in cities? Do you stop for dinner? Do you stop whenever the driver wants?
Yes, basically you stop whenever the drivers want, but they will let you stop for food. They will go to little restaurants, gargot. And you can eat there, have a quick meal, very Malagasy style food, and then the drivers will horn, and then everybody gets back. Keep going.
And how many people might be in a van?
It depends. There are better sprinter cars, so that would be maybe 40. It's hard to say, but it also depends on how long the trip is. So, the cars are different for different.
Oh, so trips. Different size cars, different size.
Yes, for shorter trips, say 6-hour trips, they will squeeze as many as possible. So, it really reaches the highest capacity.
Yeah. Now, as far as your how you're approaching the research or just being there, as soon as you land, do you turn into a sort of analysis mode? Are you taking notes already? When you're in the van, are you thinking anthropologically?
Sort of. From the first day I landed in Madagascar, I started to take notes every day. But the first month, I spent the whole first month trying to figure out how to extend my visa in Madagascar and in the capital city, which is not where I work. So the first, but then I wrote down all the experiences of just trying to figure out how to extend my visa. Because how the visa works is that if you go to Madagascar on tourism visa, you can get 1 or 2 or 3 months a visa at airport. But if you want to go for a longer period of time, you have to apply for a temporary visa, which is valid for 1 month before you go. So I applied it through the embassy in Ottawa in Canada. Mm-hmm. Then once you land there, you have to go to the right government agency and extend your visa. And that gave me so much trouble because nowhere I can find which is the right place to extend the visa. So I actually tried several agencies with the help of a very good Malagasy friend. Mm-hmm.
And so are these friends that you've made on previous trips or just people that are willing to help?
Yeah, no, this friend is like a acquaintance of my supervisor, so we got into contact before I went. So we went to, of course, the first place to try is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But then we went several times and they said they don't deal with this. And we went to Ministry of Higher Education for different documents, and we were eventually sent to Ministry of Interior Affairs. And that's the right place. But it really took a long time for us to figure out.
So at this point, the focus of your research is the Chinese or the interactions, I should say, between the Chinese.
The Chinese-Malagasy encounters.
Okay. Yeah. And so are you seeing Chinese already at this point when you're trying to get your visa, or are you the only Chinese person in Madagascar? How's it going?
No, I was definitely not the only Chinese person in Madagascar. In the capital, there is a big quartier, a big section. Mm-hmm. It's called the Malagasy Chinatown. But it's not the same as we imagine in North America, like Chinatowns with,
There's no welcome gate and everything.
No, exactly. The Chinatown basically means lots of shops that are owned by Chinese private businessmen. And they bring in lots of commodities, cell phones, electronic devices for sale. Yeah. And it's just and malls that people or Chinese merchants sell clothes.
So you're already exploring. Presumably, you have to look for things to keep your.
Yeah, I definitally checked it out. Okay. But because I know that my goal is to go to the city in the north, so I did not try to engage more with the Chinese who are based in the capital.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I did check it out, and it's interesting to see because the Chinatown area in Antananarivo is very, very, very busy. You hardly have space to walk on the street because it's just so many street vendors and there are so many people. It's a commercial area.
Mm-hmm. And is the city relatively densely populated?
Yes, in the capital city, definitely. Yeah, it's very dense.
So we should dispel those sort of notions that people have of Madagascar as like this wild island right away.
Oh yeah, definitely. The media definitely didn't construct the right image. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so let's go to the city in the north that
Okay.
I have already forgotten how to pronounce.
Antirana or Diego Suarez?
Okay, and Diego Suarez, so was it colonized by the Spanish at some point, or?
No, it was French. It was French.
Always French.
Yeah,
Okay.
it was French. And now the official name, they changed it to the Malagasy name,
Mhm.
Antiranana. But if people say Diego, people who know Madagascar immediately knows where it is.
And are most people you're interacting with bilingual with French and Malagasy, or most people just speaking Malagasy?
It depends on where you are. If you're in a rural area, actually people don't know much French. It depends on how much education they get. But for city people, yes, French will definitely, you will get by.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. So you get to this town in the north, and your goal is to study the sugar plantations then?
Yes, that was the initial goal. But then
Okay.
I expanded my scope of my research because I realized there are several types of Chinese in doing stuff in Madagascar. And in the beginning, you would imagine that they don't interact with each other too much. But actually, because there are not so many Chinese there, different types of Chinese, they interact a lot with each other. There are very different kinds of Chinese there, and you would not imagine, if they were in China, you would not imagine that they crossed their paths. But because they are all in Madagascar doing their own projects, it forms kind of a community of Chinese community. It's like everybody kind of knows everybody. So the three scopes that I looked at for my research, the first one, yes, is the state-owned corporation that managed the sugar plantation. The second scope is the networks of private businessmen who brings Chinese commodities to Madagascar. And the third one is the Confucius Institute. It's a government-sponsored agency that promotes Chinese language and culture worldwide.
So that's pretty interesting. You have three different perspectives that you're looking into this from. Tell me, how do the interactions start? How do you dive into this sort of research? You just go around, shake hands, and...
It's very interesting because that's one of the charms of anthropological fieldwork. You never know who you're going to meet and how your research, which direction is going to go. But luckily for me, I live on campus. I live on the campus of the University of Antsiranana, and they have a bungalow which is right on the coast, right on the shore of the ocean. And that bungalow is the only facility that the university has for foreign teachers. Because I agreed to the university that I would volunteer teaching English language to Malagasy student. That's why they put me in one of the rooms in the bungalow. There are 8 rooms in total. And luckily for me, there are already 2 Confucius Institute instructors living there. So we became neighbors. And that interaction just started right from the beginning, from the day that I moved into that bungalow. Now,
as far as field work goes, when you meet them, you have to say, full disclaimer, I'm writing down everything we're saying.
Yeah, that's required by the ethics board of my university. So if you want to do interviews with them, you have to inform them. But I did a lot of verbal consent instead of, signing a lot of signatures on papers. So I just tell them what I do and I might interview you. Yeah. But that's a little bit tricky for anthropological work because we do a lot of participant observation, and sometimes it's hard to draw the boundary between what is a formal interview and what is an informal interaction.
And I imagine these people become friends relatively quickly. Does that change, or how does that impact your interactions.
Yeah, anthropologists always gets kind of too involved with the participants, with the informants, and that's unavoidable. Yeah.
Do they still, I remember reading this from my undergrad days, so excuse me if this is an antiquated term, but do they still say going native?
Oh, no, you don't say that anymore. Yeah, that, I mean, just look at my case. I'm already a Chinese national, so that's just problematic. What do you mean by going native? And yeah, no, you don't say that anymore.
Right.
But one thing that you would notice is that even though you're all Chinese, but you see how different you are, within the Chinese community in Madagascar.
Yeah, so you've sort of mentioned that already, that there are these different Chinese communities that would not necessarily be brought together in any case in China. And immediately I'm thinking of sort of the way the Korean American community has gathered around like Presbyterian religion in the United States as like people who might not necessarily be linked in Korea come into an organizational tie. Are the Chinese in Madagascar tied together through work, or are there other local organizations that they're working together with each other in?
In my case, it's mainly work, and it's just because of their shared ethnicity that ultimately bring people together. But that goes to an interesting topic that I would love to explain too, because there are some Chinese organizations, associations, but they are mainly what we call the old Chinese in Madagascar. And that goes back to history. I'm not a historian, but
we can't all be perfect.
But I'm just going to say a little bit about the history of the Cantonese-speaking Chinese in Madagascar. So the old Chinese are also called they are also Cantonese-speaking, and right now they are very integrated in the Malagasy society. But they came to Madagascar in the 18th and 19th century, and they were brought by the French colonials. So they came to work as indentured laborers on plantations for the French people during the colonial times. And a lot of them stayed in Madagascar and married Malagasy people, integrated with the local society. So when you mention the Chinese associations, they are mainly the associations for the old Chinese or the Cantonese-speaking Chinese. But the focus of my research is the Mandarin-speaking Chinese, which is the part of the trend of in the past 2 decades that China is going out and bringing infrastructure construction projects and educational projects to Africa.
So it sounds like you have some pretty interesting lenses, one through economic interactions where people are coming for jobs and coming for money, and one where there's cultural interactions where people are coming to sort of, spread Chinese language, share Chinese culture. Can you explain a little bit maybe the different motivations and perhaps the different actions, how the interactions change between these people?
Yeah, the Chinese in Madagascar, a lot of people say it's Chinese immigrants in Madagascar, but I don't really think that's really appropriate, because when you talk about immigration, the first thing you would come to mind is like the immigrants who come to, for example, America or Canada, and they're marginalized. In a way, it is like the Chinese, but then the Chinese who go to Madagascar, those ones that I'm researching on, they don't really have the attention to settle. They are just working in Madagascar. And then a lot of them working under contracts. And once they finish their contract, they would leave. And the only motivation for a lot of them, is just to make more money. And that goes back to the topic of the heterogeneity of Chinese in Madagascar. For people who are working on infrastructure constructions or projects or the sugar plantation, a lot of them are do not have much education, I would say.
And when you're talking about these people who are coming to earn money and potentially go back, are they mostly men? What age are they? And are they sending money back every month? How are they living?
Yeah, most of them are men in their mid-30s to mid-50s. And yes, the reason that they make more money in Madagascar is because these Chinese companies they're working for would pay them more for going to countries like Madagascar or underdeveloped countries. They would get extra bonus for working in countries like Madagascar. And yes, they definitely sent most of their money back to China, to support their family.
And so they're getting paid in renminbi?
That depends. Some companies pay some US dollars.
Okay.
I think.
But no one's getting paid in the local Malagasy?
I don't think so.
No.
Because it's a really, no, I don't think so.
Okay. And then can we contrast with the cultural workers? Who are these people who are coming to work at the Confucius Institute? And for people who don't know what the Confucius Institute is, maybe you could explain that just briefly.
Yeah, so the Confucius Institute is the kind of the Chinese equivalent of American Peace Corps or the French Alliance Française or the British Council. It's Chinese government-sponsored educational project to promote Chinese language and culture worldwide. And the way that Confucius Institute cooperate with other countries is that they will find a local educational institute and they will have cooperations with the institute. And the teachers that they send to different countries they're different levels, but the regular teachers, they call themselves volunteers, even though they are paid.
Okay.
But they are mostly university graduates.
And they're not doing it for the money. They're getting paid like enough to live, or are they getting a good salary?
They actually have a good salary.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they have a good salary. And a lot of people save some money from working for the Confucius Institute for 2 years or something. I mean, as a young graduate, that's pretty decent pay. And they get paid more if they go to countries like Madagascar again.
And now that's their choice.
Yes, that's their choice. But the way it works is that, so there are 2 universities in China that specifically cooperate with Madagascar. So all the people sent to Madagascar are from these 2 specific Chinese universities. And they could be master students, they could be undergrad students who just graduated. So, but they are young. They are definitely not the same kind of people who work for sugar plantations.
Interesting. And is there any interaction between the 2 groups?
Yes, they do. That's why it's interesting, because in China, they would probably not having so much opportunities to interact. But then once they're all in Madagascar, especially in northern Madagascar, there are only so many Chinese there. And then sometimes the Confucius Institute would send teachers to the schools that are affiliated to the sugar plantation. So they actually live in the same area. They eat in the same cafeteria. So they all know each other.
And what about the interaction with the people there, the Malagasy people? There's different people interacting with the different groups. So it's presumably students at these Confucius Institutes, whereas it would be professionals elsewhere. Does that change the sort of dynamic or the way that these Chinese people see people in Madagascar?
I think the interactions between the Chinese and Malagasy people most of times are just professional relationships. So for the Confucius Institute instructors, they interact with their students in classrooms. And because they have all kinds of regulations from the institute, they're actually not allowed to interact too much with their students outside of their professional context. Mm-hmm. For example, they are not, I would not say allowed. I mean, it's a personal choice, but they're definitely not encouraged to go to, say, discos or karaoke bars. And mostly out of safety concern. But that's kind of the regulations for them, and they have to follow these regulations. And for Chinese workers at sugar plantations, I think their relationship with Malagasy people are mainly, it's a labor relationship, because the Chinese who work in Madagascar are leading roles in different departments of the sugar plantation, and then the Malagasy people work for them. And there are different levels of Malagasy workers. There are full-time workers, seasonal workers, and there are also, of course, higher level Malagasy administrators. But obviously, the Chinese are in charge.
Interesting. And what is how are the Chinese communicating? Is it being done in Chinese? Are the Malagasy proficient, or are the Chinese learning Malagasy?
Yeah, that's interesting. Among the Chinese themselves, definitely just Chinese. But a lot of the Chinese workers, they make an effort to speak Malagasy because it's really necessary. Otherwise, there's no way to talk to their colleagues or people who work for them. And they actually, but then their Malagasy is not very good. So their Malagasy is limited to those vocabularies at working settings. Yeah, for example, at the garage, the Chinese who work at the garage would know all the terms of, different parts and of cars. And then that's interesting because those vocabularies, Malagasy don't have those vocabularies. It's French vocabularies. So the Chinese don't know what they learned, whether it's French or Malagasy. So they actually created a pidgin language. They call it, atelier, like a workshop Malagasy.
Shop talk.
Yeah, like a garage Malagasy. And then they all know that their Malagasy, only those workers who have been working for them for a while understand. And once they walk outside of that garage or outside of that sugar plantation, their Malagasy is not understandable anymore because they have like a strong Chinese accent when they speak Malagasy too. So it's really the workers they're familiar with.
So in a lot of ways, the worker, so that's very interesting. The Confucius Institute people now, do they get frustrated with this, or are the people who are learning in the Confucius Institutes, they're going elsewhere to work? I need to say this, like the Confucius Institute instructors do not speak Malagasy. So that's interesting because those Chinese workers who seem to be not so much educated, they come to work in Madagascar, but they are forced to learn Malagasy to talk with their employees. But the Chinese language instructors, they think they are here to teach Chinese language, and they teach Chinese language to Malagasy people by English. But remember, a lot of Malagasy people don't understand English. So it's actually harder So
Exactly. And some Chinese instructors have to find someone who is fluent in English and French and Malagasy to help them translate during their class. And some of them try to learn a bit of French to help them teach in the class. But nobody seemed to have made much effort to learn Malagasy. So that goes to one of my research findings, which is actually the Chinese classes, they are not super effective. They have Chinese instructors around for maybe many years, but many people still couldn't speak Chinese. I mean, Chinese is difficult to learn, but it's very limited about what they learned.
I definitely know the struggle with learning Chinese, that's for sure. But can you talk a little bit about the cultural interaction? I'm kind of curious. In America, people are always talking about soft power. Americans can go and be blunder abroad, but people are still going to be sort of interested in our pop stars and that sort of thing. You have a fantastic photo in your dissertation of someone wearing a T-shirt with Chinese language on it. what other sort of cultural interactions are happening where Chinese culture is going into Madagascar, or maybe Malagasy culture is being adopted by the Chinese?
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought up the comparative scope of, American soft power and Chinese soft power. To an extent, the Confucius Institute and American Peace Corps are basically doing the same thing of promoting soft power. Mm-hmm. But one interesting about the Chinese Confucius Institute is that people automatically assume its association with soft power. And it is one of the goals. But then I found that the way that they represent Chinese culture is very problematic. Because they would hold all these cultural events or singing competitions. And then they bring these costumes of Asian Chinese costumes. And I mean, the Chinese instructors, they themselves do not know Kung Fu. They do not know the Asian court dances. And they learn these videos. They learn how to do this from videos on YouTube. And then they go to teach Malagasy students to do it. And it's just a very essentialized way of representing Chinese culture.
I would imagine some of the Malagasy too see, kung fu movies on, American produced or Hong Kong produced. And, is their exposure to Chinese culture different? How are they seeing Chinese culture maybe before the Confucius Institute?
I would say they have a very generalized idea about Chinese culture, because I got so many people asking me, "Oh, do you know Kung Fu?" I'm like, "No, I don't." Yeah. But at the same time, the Confucius Institute, they are really reinforcing this very essentialized image of what Chinese culture is. And one of the instructors told me that, these are very outdated. And for her, she thinks it makes more sense to teach Malagasy students what contemporary China society is and what problems are facing and what are the contemporary issues and the contemporary cultures, but then that they are familiar with. But just because they are Chinese and somehow they teach Kung Fu and the Asian court dances makes it very authentic, which is very problematic.
Right. And unfortunately, that seems to be a common struggle of teachers all over the globe, having this knowledge and being forced to teach something else other than what they know, which is really a shame. Now, in your dissertation, you really make it a global story. So not only are you going to Madagascar, traveling all over the island, but you also have this incredible journey where you go to China and sort of flip the tables. Can you explain that?
Yeah, that is the second context of my research, because I do not only just study the direct interactions between the Chinese and Malagasy people, but also the interactions mediated by Chinese commodities, because that's, I see it as an important aspect too about the Chinese influence in Africa in general. It's not just the people, the culture, but also the influx of cheap Chinese commodities, which is not necessarily a bad thing all the time, because for the first time, maybe it brings African people cheap choices to get access to different things. But at the same time, it also shapes how African people or Malagasy people see Chinese culture and Chinese things. Because one of the most general idea they have about Chinese things is, they're low quality and then that makes my research kind of a multi-sided research. Yeah.
So what are these low quality things, or where does this perception come from, and how are they getting from China to Madagascar?
Yeah, that is a very generalized idea about Chinese commodities all over Africa. But I would say there are different quality things. Like China does not just export bad quality stuff, but it's because commodities are social commodities, are not just things. So the people who bring commodities to Africa, they choose what kind of commodities they bring. And really, the more you pay, the higher quality it is. But because a lot of people are not willing to pay so much money of what they buy. So that's why a lot of the low quality stuff reach African market.
It's what sells.
Yeah. And how did commodities go to Madagascar? So what I looked at in my research is how motorcycle spare parts reached Madagascar from Guangzhou, China. So for people who are familiar with Guangzhou, with China, Guangzhou is the import-export hub of China in the south. And that's the destination for many African businessmen. They go to Guangzhou and then to do business. And I say do business in quotation marks because it sounds very high end. But actually a lot of these African traders, they're called garbage bag merchants.
In Chinese?
I mean, yeah, in English too, because they say they do business. Actually, they're just going to China on shopping sprees. And they buy stuff and then they transported them back to Madagascar and then sell it. So
my picture, I was lucky enough to go to Guangzhou once, and it was just like this fabulous metropolis, enormously crowded, very diverse, people of, all speaking all sorts of languages, and it was hot, it was humid, it was raining and everything. So how are some of these interactions? Between these people who are coming from Malagasy, people buying things in China, and these Chinese merchants in Guangzhou who are kind of like these international salesmen, because they're getting people from all over the world, right?
Yeah, that's very interesting. So I got this opportunity because I got to know this guy who is in motorcycle spare parts business in Madagascar. And for Malagasy people, he's incredibly rich because he has his business, and he sells most of his products cheaper than his competitors because he goes to Guangzhou, and that's the only reason he gets it cheaper. And even though he triples the price, he still it's the cheapest among every business. And then it's interesting because I went with him to Guangzhou. Most of the African businessmen are really just around several areas in Guangzhou. The most famous one is called Xiaobei, and a lot of anthropologists actually did research about Xiaobei. Mm-hmm. And that's the area where a lot of the Nigerian Igbo businessmen and also just in general African businessmen go. And that area has a lot of hotels that you would not know it's hotels, but they host many African itinerary traders. And they usually have like a middleman. For the Malagasy businessman, when I went with him, there was a Malagasy lady picking everybody up at the airport. So she arranged shuttles and then picked up every Malagasy businessman from Guangzhou airport and then put us all in this hotel. And
she's living in Guangzhou?
And yeah, she is a Malagasy lady, but she lives in Guangzhou. And she definitely makes money from being the middleman. Mm. Yeah. And how the interactions were, the Chinese merchants, they are very used to African businessmen now, but they don't really know Madagascar. So when I went with this guy, they would try to speak English with us. They don't speak much English, but they would try to greet us in English, and like they know
he's not Chinese.
Yeah, that's very obvious. And then they have like basic English vocabularies, like cheap, less, higher, like this kind of vocabularies. But they don't know French at all. So I have to tell them, so my friend doesn't speak English at all. And then I have to translate for him. But it's interesting. I do not want to exaggerate my role in it because whether I'm there or not, business can be done. Mm. And it's very interesting to observe how business can be done without being able to communicate with each other. So just to give an example, how would they bargain if I were not there? Mm-hmm. So my friend would just pick up something from the wall, and then the Chinese merchant would type it on the calculator. And then if my friend wanted cheaper, then he would just he would type a cheaper number on the calculator, and then yes and no,
Yeah.
And then you will see actually how amazing it is just by face-to-face interactions. A lot of business are done. Even though a lot of times the African businessmen are in dark of many kind of unspoken rules.
So unspoken like trade rules in China or bargaining rules.
Yeah, or bargaining rules. One example would be I was mistaken as the middleman who works for the African businessman, and then they would assume that I would take commissions. Yeah, and then there is like a default commission rate, which is 1%. So if we made a deal of $100, then I would get $1 from it. A lot of people don't know about this. A lot of people know, but they have no options. They have to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, and then these guys get this product, and it's just being flown commercially back. This is no like advanced shipping technique, or how is stuff getting placed?
Yeah, that's very interesting too. How are stuff transported back? So for these, we are like what we call the garbage bag merchants, or there's an anthropologist studying it, call it low end globalization.
Mm-hmm.
So
that seems nicer.
Yeah. So for these, their stuff is really just transported back by contacting a transportation company.
Oh, so like
yeah. So they would no, not FedEx, but like shipments over the sea.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the hotels that they stayed in, they have like connections with these shipping companies, and it's just a business.
Lots of connections going through, interwoven throughout the world.
Yeah, and then at the same time, they have business like money exchange or visa services, translation services. It's a whole business.
Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious about the interaction. I didn't really ask this on the Chinese side in Madagascar, but as a Malagasy businessman, is he coming to China and not speaking Chinese? Are there places for these African merchants to eat? Is there like any sort of African community in China, or are they in and out so fast that it doesn't really matter?
Yeah, it depends. Some people do have a community. Like there is a very large population of Nigerian businessmen, and they would form organizations, and they have their church. And it also depends how long they stay in Guangzhou. And actually, a lot of African businessmen are leaving Guangzhou because it was really hard for them to have like legal status. Even though some of them marry Chinese wives, and they are still not like legal residents.
Even after marriage.
Yeah, it could not work out. I mean, it's complicated. Like China doesn't have this immigration policies like America or Canada. And then a lot of people, even though this is very specific for China. So for most countries, foreigners have the most difficulties getting in the country. But for China, it's hard to leave the country once you overstays your visa.
So what do they do if a businessman overstays or violates the law?
Yeah, so once you try to leave the country, they will catch you.
And what then?
And then they'll send you to prison.
Wow.
Yeah. It's like, that's one thing very special in China. Is like, it's hard for them to leave instead of, coming in. Yeah, leaving is hard.
So the key is not to violate any of the rules and then get out. And so is it like a sign, the close of the business trip, is it a big sigh of relief? Are there celebrations when you get back at the end of a successful business trip? Or
Yeah, because, and also it's very stressful for them. And going back to the question of what they eat, actually they don't eat much at all, like because they're on very tight schedule. This friend that I accompanied, we took the Air Mauritius flight, and the flight goes to Guangzhou directly, not directly, but from Antananarivo through Mauritius to Guangzhou once in a week. So he would always arrange a 1 week or 2 week trip and then try to finish everything in 1 week or 2 weeks. So he's on a very tight schedule, and because interactions are not smooth, so he has to arrange extra time for everything. And a routine day for my friend in China, he would get up at 7 and then got on this bus, go to the, wholesale markets, spend the whole day there till the market closed without eating really, because there's nothing to eat. And for people, just coming for 1 or 2 weeks, it's hard for them to order deliveries or know anything like that. And then they came back in town and then find maybe a cheap restaurant around and ate something. Then the next day repeat the same thing. So it's actually very exhausting for them. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and imagine in a country that you don't speak the language. And yeah, it's very hard.
Yeah, it sounds like a very confusing or challenging, at least, business, but lucrative. If you can pull it off, it works out.
Yeah, it's very lucrative, and also it's a very macho thing because a lot of people say, "Oh, going to China is hard. Doing business in China is hard," and it becomes kind of a very masculine thing to do because it's also adventure related. It's like unpredictable. And sometimes they have to risk, if the visa is not working well. So it's actually very...
And there's some sort of prestige as well, seeing the world? No.
Not so much about that. It's mainly about money. And that's why a lot of people don't want to go back before they make enough money because there are a lot of pressures, from back home in Africa. You've been in China for so long, so you have to support everything. You need to be rich. And that's why a lot of people overstayed their visa, actually. Yeah. But for my case, my Malagasy friend, he's always following the rules and coming in, going back. But he would make trips 3 times a year.
Oh, so they had to be productive and they had to be...
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah. And I asked him, what's the difference if I'm there to help him? So he told me that he could do the business by himself, obviously, just slower and less clear. Because he couldn't really understand the receipts and what he bought, how much each item costs. But because I was there, so I can explain and I can help him, figure out which is which. So, it's really fast. Just makes the whole purchase process faster and more clear.
And so you offer a really good snapshot of sort of the situation, the interactions between China and Madagascar, which I think a lot of people are interested in China and Africa. Do you see China's influence continuing to grow in Africa, especially places like Madagascar, or were there some telltale warning signs of a relationship that is not so great?
I mean, the official state policy of China right now is really just still really encouraging Chinese influences in Africa. But there are some backlashes. There are also negative voices from various African countries. But I think the trend is just going to grow because it's a state policy right now just to encourage more involvement in Africa.
And these workers and these, we can use any of them. Workers, the Confucius Institute people, the businessmen traveling, the Malagasy businessmen, are they coming back with good feedback? Do you imagine these workers, or do you know if these workers go back to China and kind of say, hey, Madagascar is a good opportunity?
That depends. You mean they go back to Madagascar or go back to China?
Yeah, so say they finish their business in Madagascar, and I imagine the Confucius Institute have a fixed term.
Yes, they do. And for the Chinese workers too. I don't... For the Confucius Institute instructors, this is a very individualized experience. Some would recommend it, and some would not. It depends on their personal experiences. But for people who work for the state-owned corporations, they I don't think they have a very positive image because That relates to the situation in China's domestic society, because they understand Madagascar as a less developed country and not much consumption choices, not much infrastructure facilities, so they would not recommend, and they would explain it as, it's a hard place to live. But for private businessmen, for Chinese private businessmen, they might recommend, because it's kind of easy to get money from doing business in Madagascar. And in Malagasy, there is an expression called "vola mafana," which means hot money. So it relates to, sometimes money are earned quickly, but maybe not all like legit ways of making them.
And so for the Malagasy, say another developing power like India or Bangladesh says, we can do the same work for you and we can send workers who are more motivated. Do you think from Madagascar there would be any motivation to turn away from China and look at another power?
This is hard to say, but right now I don't think there are much competitors.
Not many people willing to.
Yeah, exactly. And especially like the Western, traditional Western powers are kind of, drawing away from Africa. And then now China is giving so many promises, to African countries, including Madagascar. So yeah, it's very, easy for them to choose China.
Yeah, because China's the only one offering up the services. Yeah,
and without any, officially without much conditions.
And is Madagascar, now China, is a massive economy and it's involved throughout Africa. So where does Madagascar factor into this? How often will Madagascar come up on Chinese news? Is it even on the radar? Has Xi Jinping gone to Madagascar?
I think he did, but, Madagascar is not really, a keyword in Chinese news.
So it's still under the radar, but a good chance for business.
Yeah, exactly.
And, I'm going to go here anyway because this is the Hour of History. But can you talk a little bit? So you did see lemurs.
Oh, yeah, I did see lemurs. You have to see lemurs and baobab trees in Madagascar. That's a must.
So Madagascar is a beautiful place and a good place to visit?
Yes, I definitely recommend going there. And it has incredible fauna and flora, and hiking in national parks is great. Yeah, and it's a really eye-opening experience.
Do you see a lot of tourists there, or is it relatively off the beaten path still?
It depends which country you compare Madagascar to. For Madagascar, tourism is definitely one of the key economic sector. There are a lot of tourists from Europe and French and Italian tourists. But if you compare it to Cuba, it's hard. It's not so many tourists because it's harder to go.
It's very far away.
Yeah, it's very far away.
Ah, fantastic. Well, time always flies when you have a great conversation, and certainly learned a lot about Madagascar. We've reached the part in the show now where we give our one recommendation. It can be anything under the sun, but I'm sure you have a lot of recommendations. What do you have for us, Mingyuan?
Yeah, I would recommend two books, and they are anthropological books. They are ethnographies. So because I studied the Chinese Malagasy encounters, so I really contextualize the Chinese communities within the Chinese domestic society. So first of all, I would recommend an ethnography about contemporary China. It's called Anxious Wealth by John Osburg. And he talks about the state-society relationships in China and also guanxi, the connections and what exactly that means for China's new rich or China's emerging middle class. And the second thing I would recommend is an ethnography about Madagascar. It's actually my supervisor's book. It's called Made in Madagascar. It's about the sapphire trade and ecotourism in Madagascar. It's very interesting. It's a very interesting read, and I would definitely highly recommend it.
Fantastic. Yeah, we will certainly link to those at hourofhistory.com. For my recommendation, I'm going to go also with a book, but a piece of literature, actually a series, The Sea of Poppies, Flood of Fire. It's a trilogy by Amitav Ghosh, and it also takes place over the Indian Ocean, and he writes about interactions between Bengal and, travels between Indian merchants, also going to Guangzhou, which at the time was Canton. It's taking place at the height of the Opium Wars, and Amitav Ghosh just does a fantastic job with British Empire and sort of these international interactions that we're still seeing today that Mingyuan highlighted for us. So once again, thank you for joining us, Mingyuan.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, and this is Hour of History, where it's our world, anytime, any place. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.
Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to check out our recommendations page at hourofhistory.com/recs. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. There you'll find links to the books mentioned during the podcast, and if you choose to purchase one, you'll be supporting the podcast in the process. And if you still haven't gotten your fill of the Hour of History, make sure you head over to the Hour of History blog, found at hourofhistory.com/blog, with articles being released fairly often on topics relating to those covered in the podcast as well as others. With that, we conclude this episode and hope to have you back for the next one. Take care, and again, thanks for listening to the Hour of History podcast.